Hi, 8th grade students. This is Mrs. Guido. I'm going to be reading our homework textbook reading to you. I'll offer that audio support. And if it helps, please use it. As you can see in our document for today, the text is on the left hand side, and you'll have some main ideas and some of your questions on the right hand side that you can answer while you're reading, after you read. But it is important that you are reading them before you go to the text. So I will also model that for you. So before we start reading today, let's set a purpose for reading. Question number one says, in your own words, what was the Zimmerman telegram? And so there's a sentence starter there for you. The next question you'll be answering is, why was the Russian Revolution in March of 1917 referred to as the removal of the final obstacle to America's entry into the war? Um, and I gave you a sentence starter there as well. So, why was the Russian Revolution called that last barrier, that last obstacle to America joining the war? Question number three, we want you to connect. So, think about your answer to the question about the Russian Revolution and look at the quote from Wilson that I made an arrow to on the left hand side of your page. So you're going to ask yourself, how does Wilson's quote that talks about fighting for democracy, how does it connect to what happened in the Russian Revolution and to America joining the war? And then as you continue reading, there's no more questions to answer, but now we're going to be practicing the skill of highlighting. So, determining the most important words in the text and highlighting. And for this, I ask you, please, please, please be mindful that we're not highlighting everything. Because if we highlight everything, we're really saying nothing's important, right? Highlighting allows us to identify the most important word or phrase. So, as you work on the remainder of the reading, please be mindful that when we highlight, we're just finding the most important word or phrase. So, considering that, as we read the Building the Military section, you're going to be highlighting two examples of how soldiers were found or they acquired soldiers to fight. Um, and then you're going to look at two examples of how women served in the military. There are several, and you'll highlight two. Again, trying to just highlight words or phrases. As we continue, there are three specific women that you're going to look for keywords of their role or what they did, um, how they served. And then as you continue, you're going to look for keywords to identify some details to give insight into the experience of African Americans who served during the war. Obviously, this is not all um, service members' experiences that were African American, but just looking for some details in the text. Then you're looking for an example of one example of how the military offered an opportunity for education. And on this last page, you're going to look for an example of how the U.S. Prepared for war related to food, related to industries or businesses, and then also an example of how they found workers to fill the jobs when men joined the military. So, the first half of your reading, you'll be answering three questions. But the second half of your reading tonight, you're going to be practicing determining importance and highlighting just keywords or key phrases. Now I'll read. On May 7th, 1915, a U boat sank a British passenger liner, the Lusitania, off the coast of Ireland. Nearly 1,200 people died, 128 of them Americans. Wilson made angry protests to Germany. The Germans responded that the ship was carrying a load of ammunition to England. This argument mattered little to an outraged American public, fearing that further attacks were liable to provoke the United States to declare war. Germany says its U-boats would no longer target passenger liners and neutral merchant ships. Entering the war. Wilson was reelected in November 1916 on the slogan, quote unquote, he kept us out of war. He then called on the warring powers to accept peace without victory. Such a peace, he said, should be based on the principles of democracy, freedom of the seas, and the avoidance of entangling alliances. But Wilson's attempt to make peace failed. Germany resumed unrestricted submarine warfare in February 1917. Germany hoped that cutting off American supplies to the British would break the stalemate on the Western Front. In response, Wilson cut off diplomatic relations with Germany. Now, as we read this next section, keep this question in mind. You're going to have to put the Zimmerman telegram in your own words. Zimmerman telegram. On February 24th, Wilson was shown a telegram that the British had intercepted. Germany's foreign minister, Arthur Zimmerman, proposed that Mexico join the war on Germany's side. In return, Germany would help Mexico reconquer New Mexico, Texas, and Arizona. The Zimmerman telegram was released to the press on March 1st. American anger exploded. Anger soon turned to thoughts of war after U-boats sank 3 American merchant ships. If you need to pause the video to answer question 1, please do so, and push play when you're ready to continue. Russian Revolution. In this section, please make sure you're paying close attention to see if there's information to answer question 2 and question 3. A revolution in Russia removed the final obstacle to America's entry. Russia was one of the 3 main allies. Its ruler, Tsar Nicholas II, II, was an absolute monarch who had long resisted calls for democratic reforms. In March 1917, military defeats and food shortages led to an uprising. The Tsar was overthrown. A new government vowed to keep Russia in the war. The fall of the Tsar made it easier for the United States to enter the war. By joining with the Allied powers, the United States would not be siding with a tyrant. Instead, Wilson reasoned, it would be joining with other democracies to fight tyranny. Declaring war. On April 2nd, Wilson asked Congress to declare war against the Central Powers. His goal, he declared, was to fight for the rights of nations, great and small, and the privilege of men everywhere to choose their way of life and of obedience. The world must be made safe for democracy. Congress overwhelmingly gave its approval. After nearly 3 years on the sidelines, the United States was at war. At this point, please pause the video to answer questions 2 and 3, and then push play when you're ready to continue. This next section, again, we're practicing the skill of highlighting important words or phrases to see how the United States prepared for war. Building the military. The United States entered the war with a large navy. However, it had only the world's 16th largest army, numbering just 125,000 men. In order to contribute to an Allied victory, the nation would have to mobilize quickly. To mobilize is to prepare for war. Again, for this section, look for a key word or words to show 2 examples of how soldiers were acquired. Selective service. Immediately after the United States declared war, eager young men began volunteering for military service. Still, volunteers alone would not be enough to expand the army quickly. Wilson called upon Congress to establish a draft. After a month of debate, Congress passed the Selective Service Act. The law required all young men between the ages of 21 and 30 to register for the military draft. By war's end, almost 4 million Americans had served in uniform. While we read this next section, highlight two examples, again, word or phrases, to show how women served in the military. Women were not subject to the draft. Still, American women had a long history of volunteerism, especially during the Progressive Era. More than 30,000 women volunteered for service. Two-thirds of these women served in the U.S. Army and U.S. Navy Nurse Corps. The rest performed clerical work, such as filing papers or sending and receiving telegraph messages, as members of the U.S. Navy and U.S. Marine Corps. They became the first women in American history to hold official military rank. Continuing with this second part of the section, highlight any key words to show the role of these three women: Jane Addams, Janet Rankin, and Carrie Chapman Catt. Still, leading American women were divided over the war. Some opposed war under all circumstances. Jane Addams co founded the Women's Peace Party in 1915 and continued to speak out for peace even after the United States entered the war. Representative Janet Rankin of Montana, the first woman elected to Congress, voted against Wilson's war resolution. As a woman, I can't go to war, Rankin said, and I refuse to send anyone else. Others, such as suffragist Carrie Chapman Catt, urged women to support the war effort. Catt hoped that women's wartime service would accelerate or increase their drive to win the vote. In fact, this proved to be the case. As you have read, Congress passed the 19th Amendment in 1919, shortly after the end of World War I. Again, please make sure you're highlighting key words related to the roles these women played. Some of them may sound familiar from our Progressive Era project. A diverse force. The military reflected the increasingly diverse makeup of the nation. About 1 in every 5 recruits had been born in foreign lands, such as the Philippines, Mexico, or Italy. Many others were children of immigrants. Native Americans were not American citizens at the time. Therefore, they were not subject to the draft. Still, a large number of Native Americans volunteered for service. As we read this next section, please look for key words to show details about the experience of African Americans who served during the war. African Americans serve. Some 380,000 African Americans also served during the war. Their opportunities were restricted by official segregation and widespread racism. Still, civil rights leader W.E.B. Du Bois encouraged African Americans to support the war effort. Let us, while the war lasts, forget our special grievances and close ranks with our fellow citizens, he urged. Still, African Americans faced discrimination in the military. They were placed in all-black units, of which only 10% were sent to combat. Most African American troops were confined to such non-combat duties as unloading ships, working in kitchens, or constructing barracks. Some African American units fought under French command. Several members of a unit known as the Harlem Hellfighters received France's highest medal for bravery, the Cross of War. This next section, I want you to look for an example of how the military offered opportunities for an education. 1 in 4 draftees and recruits were illiterate, which means they were unable to read and write. They could not read newspapers or even write letters home to their families. In addition, some young men from poor rural areas were not used to eating daily meals, taking regular baths, or using indoor plumbing. For these young men, the military served as a great educator. The Army taught millions not only how to fight, but how to read. Recruits learned about nutrition, personal hygiene, and patriotism. And finally, on this page, in each section, you'll look for an example of how the U.S. prepared. Managing the war effort. Entry into the war forced a reshaping of the nation's economy. Both agriculture and industry mobilized for war. Managing food supplies. President Wilson chose Herbert Hoover to head a new food administration. Early in the war, Hoover had directed relief efforts in Belgium. His new job was to assure adequate or enough food supplies for both civilians and troops. Hoover urged Americans to conserve valuable food resources. To save on food, Americans observed quote unquote wheatless Mondays and quote unquote meatless Tuesdays. Many grew their own vegetables in what were known as victory gardens. The president's wife had one on the White House lawn. Producing for war. The war greatly increased demands on American industries. For example, the government placed orders for 2 million rifles and 130 million pairs of socks. To oversee the shift to war production, Wilson set up a new agency, what was called the War Industries Board, also known as WIB. At first, the WIB had limited power. During an unusually cold winter in 1917 to 1918, there were shortages of fuel and crippling congestion at ports and on railroads. Wilson strengthened the War Board and gave it a new head, Bernard Baruch. The board told industries what to produce, how much to charge, and how to use scarce resources. For example, to make sure there was enough tin for military use, the WIB forbade or didn't let toy makers use tin for toys. And finally, finding workers. War brought a labor shortage as millions of men joined the military. Also, there was a steep drop in immigration to a tenth of its pre war rate. To meet war demands, American industry needed workers. To fill the jobs, business owners turned to two main sources. Women took on roles previously denied them, for example, as factory workers or elevator operators. And more than 500,000 African Americans left the rural South to work in factories of the Midwest and Northeast. They were drawn by the opportunity to earn money and to escape segregation. At this point, we're done with the reading. Please make sure, if you need to, you're going back to your questions or your text to finish answering and to finish highlighting. Again, just keywords or phrases. Please try not to highlight everything.